April 1991, Custer County, Nebraska. The wind had a name there. It was not a gentle breeze. It was not a cooling zephyr. It was a constant presence, a sculptor of land and of people. It was the shaping hand that gave the sandhills their form, their character, their eternal shifting threat. In the spring of that year, the wind spoke of rain that did not come. It spoke in whispers of dust from the newly tilled fields to the east, a fine brown haze on the horizon. It carried the scent of anhydrous ammonia, the sharp, sterile promise of modern agriculture. It carried the pollen of corn that was not yet planted, a ghost of the monoculture that covered the plains. And on the Hayes farm, 10 miles north of Broken Bow, it spoke of an ending. Elspeth Hayes, 54 years old, stood at the edge of the west field. She was a woman made of the same tough, resilient material as the land itself. Her hands were not soft. Her face was a map of sun and wind, of worry and resolve. She wore practical denim, boots caked with the pale, sandy soil of her own property. She stood and she listened to the wind, and she looked at the 80 acres of ruin that belonged to her. The west field. It had once been the farm's best pasture. Her husband, Frank, had always said so. Deep soil, good grass. He had passed 4 years prior, his heart giving out in the same quiet, final way a dry, rotted fence post finally gives way to the wind. Elspeth remained. The farm remained. The debt remained. But the west field was no longer pasture. It was no longer anything. A dry autumn, a winter with no snow cover, and the relentless winds of March had conspired to murder it. The overgrazed roots of the brome and fescue had given up their hold. The thin layer of topsoil, painstakingly built over decades, had lifted into the air and departed for Iowa. What was left was the raw material of the sandhills. Sand, fine, pale, almost white. It drifted like snow, piling against the few remaining clumps of yucca, burying the fence lines. A sand blow, an 80-acre desert of her own making, or so the neighbors whispered. Dale Harding, the Custer County agricultural inspector, did not whisper. He declared. He was a man of science, of numbers, of government forms in triplicate. He had come out the week before in his clean Ford pickup, his clipboard a shield against the gritty reality of the place. He had walked 50 feet into the field, his polished boots sinking, and had stopped. He had taken soil samples, little bags of sterile-looking sand. The report came back on Tuesday. Elspeth had it on her kitchen table, next to a chipped ceramic mug. The numbers were stark. Organic matter, 0.1%. Nitrogen, undetectable. Phosphorus, 3 parts per million. Potassium, 22 parts per million. Cation exchange capacity, negligible. Harding had called her. His voice was not unkind, it was simply factual, the voice of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. The field was dead, he had explained, biologically inactive. It would not hold water. It would not hold nutrients. Planting anything in it would be, his word, folly. He recommended she enroll it in a government set-aside program, plant a cheap cover crop of rye to try and hold what was left, and focus her resources on her other, still viable land. It was sound advice. It was logical advice. It was the advice any sane farmer in Custer County would have followed. Elspeth Hayes was not, in that moment, concerned with being a sane farmer. She was concerned with the 80 acres of sand that stared back at the sky. So she did something else. She drove her dusty 10-year-old Chevrolet C10 into town. Not to the Custer County USDA office to sign papers. Not to the Farmers Cooperative to order rye seed. She drove to the First National Bank of Broken Bow. She walked past the teller line, past the loan officers in their starched shirts, and went to her safety deposit box. Inside were the farm's deed, her husband's life insurance policy, and 3 bonds her father had bought for her when she was born. United States savings bonds, matured and forgotten. A little over $11,000. Her emergency fund, her final backstop against utter disaster. She cashed them in, all 3. The teller, a young woman whose parents farmed near Myrna, raised an eyebrow. $11,000 was a significant amount of cash for anyone to be walking around with in Custer County in 1991. For a widow farmer with a well-known sand blow problem, it was downright baffling. Elspeth folded the bills into her purse and walked out. She did not go home. She went to the public library. She sat in the reference section for 3 hours with a stack of books on native prairie ecosystems and a telephone book for the state of Minnesota. She made a single, long-distance phone call. The men of the county had a word for what drove women like Elspeth Hayes, widows left alone with too much land and too much work. The word was grief. They said it made women do strange things. It made them sell off prize-winning bulls. It made them let the paint peel on the barn. It made them, in this case, stare into the wind and see things that were not there. Grief was the explanation. It was a simple, tidy, and compassionate diagnosis for what was about to happen. What happened was a transaction, a flurry of them. The first was the phone call from the library to a place called Prairie Moon Nursery in Winona, Minnesota, a place no one in Custer County had ever heard of. They did not sell Pioneer Hybrid 3394 corn. They did not sell DeKalb 520 soybeans. They sold seeds with names like poetry, like history. Elspeth Hayes sat at her kitchen table that night, the official death certificate of her Westfield on one side, a blank sheet of paper on the other. She began to write. It was a shopping list, a recipe for resurrection. For the tall grass component, she ordered Big Blue Stem Andropogon girardii at 450 pounds, Indian grass Sorghastrum nutans at 170 pounds, switchgrass Panicum virgatum, the cave-in rock variety, at 100 pounds. The cost was staggering. These were not bulk commodities. This was specialty material sold by the pure live seed pound. For the midgrasses, the stabilizers, Little Blue Stem Schizocurium scoparium, 200 pounds. Side oats grama, Butalua curtipendula, 150 pounds. These were the workhorses, the ones that would fill the gaps, their fibrous roots a net to catch the shifting sand. Then came the forbs, the flowers, the things that any corn and bean farmer would call a weed. These were the most expensive of all, their seeds tiny, difficult to harvest, sold by the ounce. Purple prairie clover, Dalia purpurea, 5 pounds. For the nitrogen, a legume that made its own fertilizer, pulling it from the air. Lead plant, Amorpha canescens, 2 pounds. Another nitrogen fixer, its roots like black wiry fingers plunging 10, 15 feet into the ground. Butterfly milkweed, Asclepias tuberosa, 1 pound. For the monarchs, her husband had loved the monarchs. Compass plant, Silphium laciniatum. rosinweed, Silphium integrifolium, stiff goldenrod, Oligoneuron rigidum, pale purple coneflower, Echinacea pallida, black-eyed Susan, Rudbeckia hirta. Dozens more. Ounces of this, half-pounds of that. A complex, bewildering cocktail of life, designed not for yield, not for tonnage, but for synergy, for permanence. The total cost of the seed, delivered by freight to Broken Bow, was $7,822 for 80 acres of dead sand. The men at the co-op, when they heard, laughed, not cruelly, but with the deep, knowing chuckle of men who understood the land, who knew the numbers. $7,000 for weed seed. You could buy a decent used pickup for that. You could buy enough hybrid seed corn to plant 200 acres. You could take a vacation. You could do anything but throw it away on the sand. They imagined the tiny, expensive seeds, a handful of dust thrown into the wind, a fool's errand, an act of grief. The second transaction was for a machine. Planting this strange, fluffy, multi-sized seed mix was not possible with a standard grain drill. The big, fluffy bluestem seeds would bridge and clog. The tiny, dense forb seeds would fall through too fast. Elspeth knew this. Her research had been thorough. She needed a special piece of equipment, a no-till native seed drill. She found one listed in a farm paper. A used Truax FLX-2, 3 years old, sitting on a dealer's lot in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. It had multiple seed boxes, agitators for the fluffy seeds, precise metering for the small seeds, and disc openers designed to slice through trash and deposit the seed at the perfect shallow depth. It was a piece of conservation equipment, mostly used by the government for highway medians and wildlife preserves. No farmer in Custer County owned one. She drove the 5 hours to Sioux Falls. She inspected the machine herself. She checked the bearings, the coulters, the seed tubes. She haggled with the dealer, a man who saw a lone widow and thought he had an easy sale. He was wrong. Elspeth knew the machine. She pointed out a worn chain, a slight bend in the frame. She got him down another $300. The final price was $3,400, plus the cost of fuel to haul it back to Nebraska. Her savings bonds were gone. The $11,000 had been converted into a mountain of paper sacks, filled with what looked like chaff and a heavy, complicated piece of green-painted steel. The news of the drill spread faster than the news of the seed. It was tangible. It was visible. Her neighbor to the south, a man who farmed 2,000 acres of irrigated corn, saw her pull in with the Truax drill hitched to her old Chevy. He stopped his John Deere planter, a brand-new 12-row model that had cost him $60,000, and watched her. He shook his head. He did not wave. The community had rendered its verdict before the first seed was even in the ground. The verdict was unanimous. At the diner in Broken Bow, where the farmers gathered for coffee at 6 a.m., in the aisles of the grocery store, in the parking lot of the Lutheran church after Sunday service, the verdict was a sad shake of the head, a murmured, "Bless her heart," a quiet confirmation of the shared diagnosis: grief. It was the only explanation that made sense, because the alternative was that Elspeth Hayes, a woman they had known their whole lives, was a fool. And they were, for the most part, kind people. They preferred the more charitable explanation. Their reasoning was sound. It was based on a century of agricultural practice in Custer County. It was based on economics. It was based on the hard, cold science of their time and place. First, the land itself. The West Field was not just poor. It was, as Dale Harding's report proved, devoid of the very building blocks of agriculture. Soil is a living thing, a complex matrix of minerals, organic matter, water, air, and a universe of microorganisms. The West Field was not soil. It was a mineral deposit. It was sand. To grow a crop like corn, which required 1.2 pounds of nitrogen for every bushel produced, in that field would be like trying to grow orchids on a tabletop. The inputs required would be astronomical. The water would run straight through. The fertilizer would leach away before the plant could use it. It was a black hole for resources. Second, the economics of 1991. The price of corn was hovering around $2.30 a bushel. A good farmer, on good land, with good weather and a center pivot irrigation system, could hope for a yield of 150 bushels per acre. That was $345 per acre in gross revenue. From that, you had to subtract the cost of seed, fertilizer, herbicide, insecticide, fuel for the tractor, electricity for the pivot, maintenance, and taxes. The margins were thin, even on the best land. On a field like the West Field, the calculation was simple. Infinite cost, zero revenue. It was a money pit, a guaranteed loss. The conventional wisdom, therefore, was to minimize that loss. Harding's advice was the perfect expression of this wisdom. Enroll in the Conservation Reserve Program. The government would pay you a small stipend, maybe $50 an acre, to not farm it. You plant a cheap cover of something that will hold the soil, like rye or Sudan grass. You spend a few $100s to stop the bleeding and collect a small, guaranteed check. You cut your losses. You live to fight another day on your productive acres. This was not just business sense. It was the gospel of modern farming. Elspeth's plan defied this gospel at every turn. She was not minimizing her investment. She was maximizing it. She spent nearly $100 an acre on seed alone. Another $42 an acre for the drill, amortized over just that one field. She was pouring money, good money, into the worst piece of land in the county. And for what? What was the crop? A mix of grasses and weeds. What was the market for big blue-stem hay? There was none. You couldn't feed it to cattle in a feedlot. It wasn't rich enough. You couldn't sell it to the ethanol plant. There was no column for mixed prairie forbs on the futures board at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. She was not planting a crop. She was planting a museum exhibit, an expensive 80-acre hobby. The men at the diner, stirring their coffee, could explain it. Frank was the farmer, they said. Elsie just helped out. She was lost without him. She didn't understand the business side of it. She was acting from the heart, not the head. It was a sentimental gesture, a tribute to the prairies that were there before her grandfather broke the sod. A beautiful, tragic, and financially ruinous poem written on the land. Dale Harding, the ag inspector, heard the stories. He felt a pang of professional pity. He had given her the correct advice. He had the science on his side. He had done his job. He filed his report and moved on. There were other farms, other problems, other farmers who would listen to reason. He put Elspeth Hayes and her dead field out of his mind. The planting began in late April. Elspeth did it all herself. She spent 2 days in the machine shed, calibrating the Truax drill. She mixed the seeds in a specific ratio, using a small cement mixer to blend the fluffy, light seeds with the small, dense ones, using damp sand as a carrier to keep them from separating in the hopper. It was a slow, dusty, meticulous process. Then came the long days in the tractor cab. Her tractor was an old International Harvester 886, a relic from the 1970s. It was not air-conditioned. It did not have a radio. There was only the roar of the diesel engine and the rhythmic clank and whir of the drill behind her. She drove slowly, 3 miles per hour. The coulter discs sliced neat, narrow slits in the sand. The seed tubes dropped their precious, expensive cargo into the slits. The press wheels followed, closing the furrows, ensuring good seed-to-soil contact, or in this case, seed-to-sand contact. Round and round the 80-acre field she went, a small red tractor and a green drill, a lone ship on a pale, empty ocean. Her neighbors, planting their corn on the other side of the fence with their huge, modern machines, could cover 80 acres in a morning. It took Elspeth 4 full days, from sunup to sundown. She was a spectacle. People drove by on the county road just to look. They saw the cloud of dust from her tractor, the sheer, stubborn, lonely effort of it all. And they saw the field, the empty, wind-swept sand. They shook their heads and drove on. When the planting was done, she waited, and the county waited with her, to see what would come of this grand, foolish experiment. The year 1991 passed. A light rain in May germinated the seeds. But what came up was not a lush green carpet. It was sparse. Patches of tiny green shoots separated by wide expanses of bare sand. From the road, the field still looked dead. The neighbor's corn, by contrast, was a miracle of modern science. It shot up, dark green and uniform, fueled by nitrogen and water from the Ogallala Aquifer. By July, it was shoulder high. By August, it was heavy with ears. In Elspeth's field, the tiny plants seemed to struggle. They grew slowly. Weeds, the opportunistic annuals like lamb's quarter and pigweed, seemed to do better than the expensive prairie seeds. The men at the diner nodded. They knew it. You couldn't just plant grass. The weeds would take over. She had wasted her money. Elspeth knew this was coming. The books had told her. The first year, they sleep. The second year, they creep. The third year, they leap. The prairie plants were not growing up. They were growing down. They were spending their energy building root systems, plumbing the depths of the sand, searching for the memory of water, the ghost of stability. But from the surface, it looked like failure. That fall, the corn harvest was a good one. The combines rolled, filling trucks with a river of golden grain. The price was decent. The farmers paid down their operating loans. They felt vindicated in their methods. Elspeth's field was a quiet, raggedy collection of brown stalks and a few hardy weeds. She did nothing to it. She did not mow it. She did not graze it. She let it stand. The year 1992 arrived. It was a wetter year. The spring rains were plentiful. The corn farmers were ecstatic. They planted fence row to fence row. More fertilizer, more seed, push the yields. The price might drop, but you could make it up on volume. In the west field, things began to change, though you had to look closely to see it. The little blue stem was starting to form clumps, its base a dense, fibrous knot. The switchgrass sent up more robust shoots. Here and there, the deep green three-lobed leaves of a compass plant lay flat against the sand, its taproot already several feet deep. The purple prairie clover was visible, small, lacy plants that, if you dug one up, had the telltale nitrogen-fixing nodules on their roots. It was still not impressive. The spaces between the plants were still bare sand, but the plants themselves were stronger. They were anchored. Elspeth would walk the field in the evenings, and she could feel a new firmness under her boots. The sand was no longer flowing like water. It was being pinned down, stitch by tiny stitch. The neighbors still saw a weedy mess. "Looks like you got your money's worth on that seed, Elsie," one called out to her at the post office, a wide grin on his face. "Got a real bumper crop of nothing." He meant it as a gentle ribbing, a neighborly joke, but it stung. The entire county was watching her, waiting for her to admit defeat. The year 1993, the third year, the leap. The field came alive. The spring rains fell, but this time the water did not immediately vanish. It was held by the growing mat of roots, by the accumulating organic matter of the previous year's growth. The big blue stem, which had been timid for 2 years, found its strength. It sent up stalks that were 3, 4, 5 feet tall. The switchgrass formed dense, impenetrable stands. The Indian grass, with its golden, feathery seed heads, waved above it all. And the flowers. For the first time, the forbs bloomed in force. Swaths of purple from the prairie clover. Spikes of brilliant orange from the butterfly milkweed. The tall, sunny faces of the compass plants, turning to follow the sun. It was not a garden. It was a riot. A chaotic, beautiful, interconnected explosion of life. The insects returned first. The bees, the wasps, the butterflies. The field hummed with a sound that had been absent from the local landscape for generations. The sound of pollination. The sound of a functioning ecosystem. Birds followed the insects, dickcissels and meadowlarks. Birds whose populations had been declining found a home in the dense grass. Pheasants, which had been scarce, began to roost in the impenetrable cover of the switchgrass. From the road, it no longer looked like failure. It looked strange. It was not a neat, orderly cornfield. It was a shaggy, wild, and undeniably vigorous expanse of green. It was taller than the corn, and it was growing without a single drop of irrigation, without a single pound of fertilizer. The talk in the diner changed. The laughter stopped. It was replaced by a confused silence. What was it? What was she doing with it? Was she going to cut it for hay? The hay would be terrible, full of stems and flowers. Was she going to graze it? Maybe. But it was still a curiosity. A beautiful, expensive, and ultimately useless curiosity. The corn was still king. The harvest of '93 was another record breaker. The bins were overflowing. The price of corn dipped below $2, but still the volume was immense. The system worked. The year 1994. The weather began to turn. The spring was dry. The summer came on hot and early. The rain did not fall in May. It did not fall in June. By July, the official term was drought. The cornfields, which had looked so invincible, began to show the stress. The leaves curled inward during the day to conserve moisture, a sign of thirst. The farmers turned on their center pivot irrigation systems. The great aluminum arms, a quarter-mile long, began their slow, clockwise crawl, spraying precious water from the Ogallala Aquifer onto the thirsty crop. The cost of electricity soared. The hum of the pivot motors was a constant, expensive drone across the county. The aquifer, the great underground sea that gave the region its life, began to drop. Wells that had been reliable for 50 years started to pump air. In Elspeth's Westfield, the prairie was unfazed. The deep-rooted native plants laughed at the drought. The big bluestem's roots were 10 feet deep. The lead plants were 15. The compass plant's taproot was a drill, seeking moisture far below the dry surface. While the corn next door was wilting, its shallow roots confined to the top foot of soil, the prairie grasses were drinking from a well the corn could not reach. The field was a vibrant green island in a sea of pale, thirsty green. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. Then came the wind, the same wind that had murdered the field 3 years earlier. It blew across the dry, stressed cornfields. It picked up the soil between the rows, soil that was no longer protected by a canopy of leaves. Dust storms, not seen on this scale since the 1970s, began to blow. The sky turned brown. The ditches filled with topsoil, the same precious topsoil that had blown off of Elspeth's field in 1990. The cycle was repeating itself all across the county. But the west field did not blow. The dense mat of grass and forbs held the sand in a tight grip. The wind could howl across the top of the 7-foot-tall grasses, but on the ground, the soil was still. Elspeth could walk into the heart of her prairie on the windiest day and find a pocket of calm. The year 1995. The drought did not break, it intensified. It was now the worst drought since the 1950s. The governor declared a state of emergency. The corn crop was a disaster, even for the farmers with irrigation. The pivots ran 24 hours a day, but the water could not keep up with the scorching heat and the dry winds. The plants were stunted, their ears small and poorly filled. Many farmers, facing bankruptcy from the electricity bills, simply shut off their wells and abandoned their crops, letting the cattle in to forage on the withered stalks. The sand blows returned with a vengeance. Fields that had been productive for decades were scoured down to the subsoil. The landscape began to resemble the black and white photographs of the Dust Bowl. A sense of panic began to set in. The system, the monoculture of corn and beans, the reliance on irrigation and chemical inputs, was collapsing. The foundation of the entire regional economy was cracking. And then there was Elspeth Hayes's 80 acres. It was not just surviving, it was thriving. It was a testament to a different kind of wisdom, a wisdom that had been ripped out and paved over a century ago. In the fall of 1995, she finally harvested. Not with a combine. She rented a seed stripper, a machine with a brush that combed the ripe seeds from the stalks without damaging the plants. She spent a week driving her old International back and forth, collecting a treasure trove. She harvested over 10,000 pounds of pure live seed. Big bluestem, switchgrass, Indian grass, and dozens of forb species. In 1991, she had paid a premium for this seed. Now it was priceless. With the drought and the dawning realization that the old way was failing, a new market had been born. A market for resilience. A market for permanence. Farmers, the same ones who had laughed, were now desperate to stop their own fields from blowing away. The government, through the USDA and the Natural Resources Conservation Service, was rolling out emergency programs to encourage the planting of native grasses. But there was a problem. There was no seed. The few specialty nurseries, like Prairie Moon, were sold out for years in advance. The demand had exploded overnight. Except for the 10,000 pounds of locally adapted, drought-proven seed sitting in Elspeth Hayes's barn. The phone started ringing in October. The first call was from her neighbor, the one with the 2,000 acres and the new John Deere planter. His voice was humbled. He asked if she had any seed to sell. He wanted to plant a buffer strip around his worst-hit field. He offered to pay her double what she had paid for it. Elspeth told him her price. It was not double. It was 5 times what she had paid.